G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic Friday. Now this video is going to be a little bit different to my usual videos. It's going to be one of the special episodes I make, and I make these on topics of which I find that need a deeper dive. And today's topic, well, this is something that many choose to ignore as it can be highly politically fueled, can be volatile, and it is very, very sensitive. Although I believe this is increasingly important and it's becoming more and more relevant and has the potential to spiral into disaster. And as you saw from the title of this video, it's about false flag events. And we're going to be looking at who is more likely at this point in time to carry out a false flag, opportunities for false flag, and intelligence operations. Now, this video, this is going to be very information front load heavy and potential to be very dry. But it will be, I hope, highly informative and a highly nuanced view of what is happening. I'm not good, obviously, at the short, sharp, things going bang, YouTube style videos to keep engagement and Mr. Beast giving out a car. Think of this more like a lecture and pieces to take away to build on yourself as well. Okay, so let's begin. We do have a lot to go over as always. Now, I've said for years, inevitably, as war continues, one side will grow more and more desperate. Therefore, initial self-imposed restrictions or limits you may have had at the beginning of the war will be jettisoned. And history shows this to be the case again and again in protracted and attritional war, from gas to submarines. In an existential battle of survival, whether it's states, its ideologies, its leaders, on this protracted attritional nature, over the length of the war, you see a descent into more brutality and then further moving into grey areas from ethics, morals, intelligence operations, and actions. Now, I've been warning of false flags for some time. And the reason I'm making this video is I'm seeing warning signs. I'm seeing red flags going up. And I'm seeing, and it makes sense rationally, that this could be in the future of what this war may become. But firstly, we're going to step back and explain and outline in this video what we will be covering. So, number one, we'll look at what false flags are. Number two is when and why they are used, with some homework for yourself as well. Number three, historical examples and examples we have seen during this war. Number four, why at this point a Ukrainian false flag is more likely than a Russian intelligence provocation. Number five, signs and symptoms of this that I'm seeing. And are we seeing the foundations being laid? Of course, the very reason I'm producing this video. Number six, an argument against my hypothesis that Russia is seeking to carry out further intelligence operations, undermine support, or gain support as well. Also, in number six and some of the others, I've had a lot of help from experts as well, and just from people with opposing opinions, which I will be sharing today. So especially those anonymous behind the scenes, apologies. Thank you so much for your help. You know who you are. There's a reason you're anonymous. I really do appreciate it though. And seven will be our final thoughts, and we'll go a little bit more philosophical. We'll talk about the spheres of influence, how to gain or lose, your neighbours, how to have influence or lose influence, and modern control and recovery of land. We may do a separate video on that, but how conquering land may not be possible anymore, but seduction of a sphere of influence may be more realistic. Okay, so back to number one. What is a false flag? Well, I'm sure you're aware, but false flags are operations of deceit. They're used by anyone, from lone actors all the way to states, all the way even to institutions, to pin blame on an enemy and create a casus belli. Casus belli, think of it as justification for further actions. Now, at the very low end, this could be as simple as ships sailing under a state flag instead of the Jolly Roger. At the extreme, it can be deliberately targeting civilians, blaming it on the adversary to force an escalation or to destroy your adversary's credibility, gain public support. But it's not only between two states. Sometimes you can have a player to pin these against each other. States' intelligence service, they can carry out a false flag, pin the event on a third state, drive two rival powers into bloody fighting, while the instigator profits from the weakening of both rival states. Typically, this is called bloodletting. When you pin two against each other, they are wearing each other out while you are gaining relative power. And you can do that through a false flag. We have warned that this is somewhat looking like China's strategy is you've got the US extended in the Middle East, extended into Europe, war in the Middle East, war in Europe, and China is sitting there, and its two largest military competitors of Russia and America, they are, through proxy if you will, but either way, wearing each other down. Of course, that's away from false flags, but that is the bloodletting that we see. You may ask, well, what about these Russian operations inside of Europe, or at least alleged operations? But I don't think there's much questioning on this. Mystery fires at industrial centres or centres being targeted. Now, I've covered these extensively with a fantastic European source who helped me actually today. But these are occurring, and yes, they're denied by the Kremlin. Of course, you would. But these are not false flags. These are grey zone intelligence operations. Most commonly, these operations, from my understanding and my sources, is that these intelligence services, these foreign intelligence services, they recruit those with access to these areas, typically someone like a cleaner, lower paid to work on behalf of the service and maybe have this mystery fire that we see. But with all of these, as you're going to see today, the intelligence services are very cautious of maintaining an element of plausible deniability, and this plausible deniability is key to many Russian operations, all the way from the KGB through to recent FSB times. But these operations, they of course are happening, but they purposely remain below the threshold that would give European NATO states casus belli. That's why I throw in doubt so many of these massive escalations that we are getting told about. So number 2, when and why are false flags used? Now, I've done, of course, a very deep dive into when and why these are carried out, and I won't bore you with that again, but I'll put on the screen here and in a couple of minutes. This is a cheat sheet that I've developed. Now, what I'd like you to do is you can pause this video, you can screenshot it, but what I want you to do is have a look at that screenshot, look at the main points in it, and put like a mark on, at this point in the war, who is more likely to benefit from these. But we'll touch on the main points of when and why. The main one is creating that justification, the casus belli, to justify war escalation by presenting the enemy as an aggressor, rallying domestic and international support. Manufacturing or manipulating public or media narratives to generate outrage, fear, sympathy, shaping events, how they're perceived at home and abroad. Swaying international opinion and allies. To attract allies, secure aid, mobilise coalitions by framing the adversary as a shared threat. Also, to detract your enemy from those international allies or opinions as well, or institutions. False flags, these are ultimately used to control political action. The narrative, the public support. In the day, a war is fought by the public. When a state is facing a military setback, internal unrest or instability, a false flag can be carried out to unite the population or justify crackdowns on dissent. We also see these become more likely after defeat or failures, as they can be used to maintain morale, to keep public support for the war. Also, to discredit the enemy, to shape that narrative and depict adversaries as irrational, barbaric, criminal, and weakening their legitimacy. Okay, so I've put the examples back on the screen now. And what I said just before is I encourage you to pause, to screenshot, to whatever, mark each one down and see at this point in the war, which ones make sense for which state. Sorry, I've got something in my eye. Now, when you're doing this, remember this further. This war has expanded from it's not just Ukraine versus Russia, although they're the ones fighting. It is the democratic liberal states versus Russia and its allies, or as people may say, the coalition of upheaval. Now, 3. We're going to go over some historical examples and examples that we have already seen during this war and some of the outcomes short and long term. So let's just belt feed through some of these, but we have ones from this war. Now, we have, of course, this is very famous and well documented, the Lavon Affair or Operation Susanna. This was carried out in Egypt, highly likely by Israel. Now, the Israeli military intelligence was planting bombs in Egyptian, American, and British-owned civilian targets, cinemas, libraries, and American educational centres with the aim of creating sufficient violence and instability to induce the British government to retain its occupying troops in Egypt's Suez Canal. So you can see the aim and how it was being carried out. Of course, posing as, in other operatives, false flag. Now, Israel publicly denied any involvement in the incident until 2005, and the surviving agents were awarded certificates of appreciation by Israeli president. So, yeah, we understand that. Now, Israel has carried out many false flag and intelligence operations, and this is why Mossad is so successful. Mossad is not only successful due to its operations, Mossad is more successful in its reputation because it has such a reputation that precedes them, and therefore people either attribute things or are very scared of it. There is no intelligence service in the world who conservative speakers online are more scared of to comment on than Mossad, and that is the reputation itself then has reached escape velocity in doing the work. Let's roll back to the Clausewitz incident. This was a false flag on the radio station here, staged by Nazi Germany on the night of 31st of August 1939, along with other incidents, but manufactured by Germany as a casus belli to justify the invasion of Poland. Despite the German government using the attack as justification to go to war with Poland, the Clausewitz assailants were not Polish, but were German SS officers wearing Polish uniforms. So these are some of the best historical examples. But let's step into this war and let's have a look at Nord Stream. Now, we're just going to be using Wikipedia and we'll add our own comments onto this. Now, remember, this is not a deep dive into either one of these. On September 26th, the 2022 news broke of 4 explosions along Nord Stream 1 and 2 natural gas pipelines. 3 separate investigations were staged by Germany, Sweden, and Denmark. The latter 2 were closed without publicly assigned responsibility for the damage in Feb 24. German authorities issued an arrest warrant for Ukrainian national suspected of the sabotage. Funnily enough, his name Vladimir Z. Not the Vladimir Z, but another one. So the other ones close this off without releasing. Shock horror. Germany did put out an arrest warrant. Now, the Nord Stream pipeline. This was both an intelligence operation and an early false flag event. Now, it was an early false flag event because once overwhelming evidence pointed to Ukraine, the investigations went silent. This is going to be relevant later on in this video when we talk about that Ukraine could more likely get away with a false flag event due to these countries being on their side and putting all of their chips in for Ukraine's success and their own ideological survival. But at the time of the Nord Stream, the European Commission said the sabotage of the Nord Stream made it clear that a critical infrastructure is under threat. European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen said any deliberate disruption of active European energy infrastructure is unacceptable and will lead to the strongest possible response until it became clear who it was. The silence following these attacks and zero accountability, this increases the likelihood for Ukraine of further actions as the risk of backlash has dropped considerably, even if it's very clear. We've set precedent that there's not going to be any backlash. That's why Ukraine has more chance of getting away with something, therefore could increase the idea of doing it. But we're going to go through that later. Destruction of the Novokhovka Dam. In the early hours of June 6, 2023, causing extensive flooding along the lower Dnieper River. Dam was, yes, under Russian control. Experts have concluded, or many experts, that Russian forces likely blew up the segment to hinder the planned Ukrainian counteroffensive. Russian authorities denied the accusation. Why? Okay, so it blew up on June the 6th. Well, June the 8th, some 2 days later, was the official start of the Ukrainian 2023 counter-offensive. Why is there a lot of doubt around this? Flooding had a lot more significant impact on the left bank, the Russian-controlled side, than on the right bank, the Ukrainian-controlled side, with a lot of claims at the time saying that the dried river could then be crossed once the flood waters had dropped. Of course, we haven't seen this. Now, this official claim as to why this is more likely Russia than it was Ukraine was the offensive in the south made it more difficult for Ukraine's offensive than it was Russia. But also you could look at this and Russia had to redeploy significant assets from Kherson into other directions, so they were able to move forces out, although it had more impact on that side. Now, I'm not saying who did or didn't do this. If you would put in front of me, I think the weight of possibilities rather than the weight of possibility versus beyond reasonable doubt. But the weight of possibility for me, I disagree with these experts. But this is a great example of the obfuscation that is caused by false flags and how political sentiments can have more impact in the blame than rationality. So if you're going off rationality, you'd be sitting where I was. I think if you're going off political statement, you'd more agree with where these experts are. And that has a lot, and that links back to the one before of why you may have more incentive to do so. The loss of water from the reservoir could threaten the long-term water supply to Russian-controlled Crimea and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, also under Russian control. There was no immediate risk to either. We'll talk about the ZNPP, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and Chernobyl in a minute. Final one. This is a good example of opportune false flag. 2022 missile in Poland that killed, sadly, 2 people. Initially, Ukraine accused Russia of striking Poland. The US claimed the missile was likely to be an air defense missile fired from Ukraine in response to a Russian missile. In September 2023, the Polish prosecutor's office stated the explosion was caused by an out-of-control S-300. Now, I have little doubt that this was an incident and not a false flag. I believe it was an incident. But this gives a good example of opportune times and taking opportunity to sell a false flag. Now, to this day, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, still has tweets blaming Russia, even if the laws of physics, being an S-300, disprove this claim. As I said, false flags are not always planned, but taking advantage of an opportunity arises. My local radio station, where I live, reported on this as a Russian missile into Poland, killing Poles. They didn't report on what the investigations found. Regardless of the truth, it did its job. You could also point towards the Moscow circus when that absolute horrific massacre took place. We did see Russian pages through to officials try and sell that it was some Ukrainian operation and therefore increase support. Now, was it or wasn't it? It doesn't look like it was with any grey zone warfare. We never truly know. But what we did see following that and the selling of that was a huge uptick in, of course, recruitment. Now, that points towards, is it a false flag carried out by the Russians to increase that support? Now, I don't believe that's likely either. I think this just was radicals on the level of this. But again, you can see where you can take opportunity for it. I'm just laying out some events and history behind what we are seeing. Now, to back down to like the meat of this, why do I believe that a Ukrainian false flag is more likely than a Russian false flag or continued Russian escalation into Europe? Well, before we get into my opinion, let's look at some others who helped me with some of my work. This gentleman here, incredibly knowledgeable. In terms of creating a false flag incident, I don't see why Russia would feasibly do something within Europe that would deliberately result in mass CAS. Like it or not, Russia knows how to play the game, and it knows Western civilian or undeployed military casualties is not deniable and could trigger a kinetic response. I think Russia will prefer to remind Europe it remains a threat rather than show how much or how little of a threat they are, as you cannot adjust or recall your hand once you play it. So once you play it, your hand's on the table. But this same gentleman, he's going to show us why Russia may continue on these operations as well later on in the video. Another gentleman here. At the end of the day, as regular people, we have to examine all claims on the basis of who would ultimately benefit the most. And as I will go over, it makes a lot of sense for Ukraine to have further countries enter this war, far less for Russia. Another gentleman. Again, it's not like I trust the SVR, Russia's foreign intelligence, any more than I trust the CIA or Ukraine's domestic intelligence, the SBU. I'm just having a hard time thinking this benefits Russia, but it is impossible. They are totally incompetent with no strategic vision of how it would play out. If I am Russia, I want as little coverage as possible to have the Europeans forget about this war far away and not give that justification. Back to what this gentleman said here, that the Russian intelligence services, they do know how to play the game. And we do know that. And a lot of people will assign all this incompetence to it, but we have seen through the history of these intelligence services, they do know how to play the game. Speak to someone who's worked in intelligence, they will tell you the same thing. Now, for me, it's simple. As far as why do I believe it's more likely here? Ukraine is losing ground, both on the battlefield and politically. And a false flag, whether to increase support, demonise Russia, or to gain kinetic NATO actions, makes far more sense for Ukraine than it does the Russians expanding this war or giving justification for a third party or a coalition of states to enter. As the war goes on and Russian victory seems more and more inevitable, there is no rational argument for risking an extension of the war into more powerful states and fighting on two fronts. Putin loves history, Russia likes history, so let's look at history. Russia has both taken advantage of states fighting on two fronts and has lost wars due to themselves being extended on two fronts previously. A case study to prove this in modern times is Russia choosing to let Syria fall into the hands of their opponents and giving very, very little support relatively. What this shows to me is this shows the understandings and the limitations in the Kremlin. They understand that limitation. And these limitations became clear after the Ukraine war bogged down in 2022 and 2023. And Syria, they poured a lot of resources in. Then we saw what happened. They didn't pour any more in. I think that is a good case study to show the understanding of the limitations and extinctions. The worst possible thing Putin can do for this war is give NATO a justification, give NATO justification to its public for the war to either go into kinetic or expansion. It's the worst thing Putin could do. The Russian intelligence services, they will absolutely continue grey zone warfare, not only in Europe, but well beyond Europe as well. That's what these services do. But all of these will remain below an actionable threshold. These services, from the FSB to the CIA to everyone in between, they have different agendas, but we cannot assume that they are irrational in their activities, even if the activity is inhumane or unclear on the initial benefits. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he stated that Ukraine does not have the power to return these occupied regions militarily. This is where his hands have somewhat been tied. Last week, US President Donald Trump, he contradicted this claim, saying Ukraine could have the power to return these militarily and return not only these territories, but go further if there was further military aid. And further military aid supplied by the US, not paid for them, paid for by the Europeans. We'll go into that pressure on the taxpayer in a second and why the war is ultimately about the public. Now, without significant escalation, Ukraine has not shown any signs of the ability to return these occupied regions. Have they had success on the battlefield? Yes. Has there been any signs that have shown realistically liberating Crimea and Donetsk and these areas? No. The 2023 counteroffensive was the best possible time and relatively heralded very little results, all of which have either been turned back or further forwards beyond them. Now, there is this illusion that more arms, just more weapons in, will return these areas. This is not only incorrect, it's misleading. Ultimately, this war is on the battlefield is a ground war and is a question of manpower. of which Ukraine doesn't have an answer to that manpower problem, or we haven't seen a suggestion of the solution to that manpower problem yet. But herein lies the issue. Zelensky, European NATO leaders, Trump, they've promised a victory. But I ask, what is the current plan to this promised victory? And as Trump put it, not only back to the borders, but even beyond now, has given the hope. And the thing is, a lot of these political survival, ideological survival, does rely on that victory now that has been set in stone. The current plan that is promised or proposed as a wonder waffle is to impact the Russian energy through strikes to a point where societal pressures amount to such a point that regular Russians rise up. They put an end not only to the war, but they put an end to Putin. This sounds nice, but the issue with this theory is its theory, that history itself doesn't show this. Actually, it shows the opposite. And Ukraine and Germany and Britain, more than anyone, should know this. Strategic bombing campaigns from the Second World War of Britain, Germany, to modern campaigns, whether against Ukrainians, Palestinians, or even Israelis by the Iranians, it clearly shows that the public see the ones firing or dropping the munitions or creating the siege as the ones causing the suffering and increasing the public resolve and support of the war, that the enemy must be defeated. They don't look internally at the government and go, these are your mistakes of why we're getting bombed. No, they look at the adversary, the ones ultimately firing the weapon system. Churchill knew this better than anyone. Churchill remarked, the bombing of London is not a deterrent, it is a stimulant. Also, where this falls apart is the illusion of, commonly referred to as like the one-man theory or one-man fallacy. This suggests that this war, is simply Putin directing events while everyone else just follows along. And this is a fallacy. Wars are waged by entire populations, not just leaders. This is why decapitation strikes rarely succeed, like knocking off the leader. Because removing one figure does not dismantle the machinery of war sustained by the broader society. Again, war is sustained by broader society. That's important. So back to the question of why do I think it's more likely to be Ukraine than Russia? Well, given what I've laid out, if you haven't got your answer yet, the best militarily possible chance Ukraine has to win militarily on the battlefield or to have leverage in negotiation is success on the battlefield. Well, this is going to require, or likely, the best possible way of doing this is to have a powerful third-party interference and something to cement European and American public support. So the best chance militarily is other parties being involved. The worst thing Putin can do is have other parties get involved. Now, what we spoke about is third-party interference, cement public support from the Europeans, the Americans, especially now that Trump has somewhat tied Zelensky's hands, tied Ukraine and Europe's hands by indicating that Ukraine can win this war and even go further. While the US, they are willing now to sell basically whatever is needed, but without the US paying for it. So he said that you can win this war with an amount of arms, but we're not going to be paying for it. So he's given reason for, he's given now tied hands to pump money in. You see where there's the problem? He's given, you can win this if you buy enough of our arms, but we're not going to be paying for it. This is where the US has somewhat tied the hands. And what we know is the strain on the European taxpayer in the near future is going to increase even further, let alone energy prices that have increased substantially and will continue to increase as more of these cheaper products get cut off, and it's going to rely more on the US and the sovereignty we can talk about in another video. Now, I always say if you can't make an argument in reverse, you have an unfounded statement and not an argument. So let's do that. If Russia was currently in Ukraine's position on the battlefield, so it was enveloped in multiple areas and was completely reliant on external support, okay? If I saw an explosion at a facility supporting, so say a Chinese facility that supplies Russia with items, this is theoretical, say, so Russia is in Ukraine's position. They're relying on external support and they're enveloped losing on the battlefield. And then I saw an explosion at a facility in China or Iran or North Korea, whatever, supplying these arms. I would have the exact same suspicion to bring in a third party to then expand the war. Same argument both ways, but we have two countries in different positions, especially that Ukraine's Schwerpunkt, the center of gravity of their military, doesn't sit in Ukraine, it sits outside for the support, but that can also come and go, where Russia sits in Moscow. Now, one thing I will say on that theory I've given is China does not have the same unquestioning loyalty to Russia that Europe does to Ukraine, but it's worth just that theory exercise to run through. Now, the problem with these democratic nation states is that further support for war can change completely, either just through public opinion or at election time it can change 180 degrees. Wars are fought by publics. Therefore, maintaining support is crucial. And again, a false flag like this, it does make complete strategic sense if we saw one of these actions. And I've said in my video, if I was in the intelligence service doing this, it makes sense. And from the examples that I've shown you, there is far less risk to the European states pointing a finger at Ukraine than there is Russia. If Russia were to carry this out, it would have to be so locked down. And even if it was, the evidence may never come out anyway, like with Nord Stream, the investigations just get cancelled. So again, if you even rise it, and this is where there's investigations that are politically fueled, if you even raise the Nord Stream attack for anything, if you even raise it, you are pinned as an enemy to the institution and as a friend of the Kremlin rather than just someone asking a legitimate question. But it gives that the risk for Ukraine is substantially reduced. So the main part of this video is, what am I seeing that gives me concern? I'm not just making shit up. What am I seeing? Now, there is a systematic campaign from the European leaders, the NATO leaders, and Zelensky that Russia is imminently planning to attack NATO. You heard it a little bit. Now you hear it every single day. Politico reported earlier this week, Zelensky, quote, Putin will not wait to finish his war in Ukraine. He will open up some other direction. No one knows where. Now, comments like this were once just off the cuff, but as I said, they're becoming daily, they're becoming a systematic chant to increase spending, justify further taxations, continuation of war, and could we see this laying groundwork? These leaders, these all exemplify the term of Russophrenia, or as I'll commonly say, Schrodinger's Putin, where Russia is simultaneously on the eve of collapse and the eve of taking over Europe. This paradox, of course, is ignored. Now, this doesn't mean it's purposely setting the stage for a false flag that is planned. It doesn't mean that. But if one does happen, it's sure as hell going to be a lot easier to sell it if you've been saying this for 6-12 months. So let's have a look at what I am seeing. And I'm aware this video is getting long in the tooth. I apologise. So let's quickly look here. Something we've spoken about a lot, mainly internally, is Zelensky tweeted yesterday, but he's had, of course, many tweets similar to this, about Russian strikes on a facility powering Chernobyl. Further, about blackouts at the ZNPP, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Of course, ZNPP is under Russian control. Chernobyl region is under Ukrainian control. It's crucial that European countries, the US, G7 and G20 nations take real action for peace, and that this is a, quote, it's a global threat. Of course, we know how deadly radiation is from Chernobyl. And many have looked at these facilities before and gone, well, this could be an area where we see one or the other carrying it out. But what I'm saying is it doesn't make sense for the position Russia's in to give casus belli for more countries to enter the fold. Okay, let's have a look at the tankers. And this is something I've spoken about a fair bit. Now let's not start there. Let's start here. We have Zelensky tweeting in his statement last week, saying intelligence now indicates Russians are using tankers to launch and operate drones against European countries. Okay. A month prior, we had this, the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, in an exclusive with Sputnik. They said that there is some intelligence agency planning to involve NATO by some level of information or attack to crack down on these tankers. Okay, what does it take to intercept these tankers by the UN territorial sea and contiguous zone? We can see right here that launching, landing, or taking on board aircraft of any type, launching any military device. So we see back in August saying, hey, there's going to be something against these tankers. We see Zelensky saying drones are being fired. We know what needs to then occur. And then yesterday, on the 1st, but yesterday my time, on the 2nd of October, we have this. France detains 2 crew members of Russian-linked tanker off the western French coast. Tanker is suspected of being involved in these drone overflights. Macron saying there were some serious offences committed by this crew which justify the current judicial procedure. Okay, can you see where I'm getting a little bit suspicious? But that's just some of it. So we have talking about ZAP, talking about this, but again, intelligence reports or reports from states, this can just be a proper warning as well. Again, I don't trust anyone. What we need to look at is the best of our ability of incentive. Now, Russian news agency TASS, they talk about Ukraine staging a powerful provocation in Poland with sabotage recon teams posing as Russian or Belarusian special forces. A sham attack on areas for provocation consisting of servicemen from the Russian or Belarusian special forces. So remember these Russian Legion that we've talked about, or this regiment here. We'll talk about these in a sec. It is not ruled out that provocation may involve simulated attacks on critical infrastructure, trying to engage European NATO countries into an armed conflict with Moscow. Zelensky's regime is prepared, shielded by its European allies to go all out, the cost of sparking a major war. And again, so to bring in other nations. Now, a press officer, I believe she is, from Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said this about drones from Hungarian media, that from downed Russian UAVs, Garans, Gaburas, whatever, that they, during like a large attack, they're going to fire them into European countries, again, as she says, to ignite an armed conflict between Russian Federation and NATO while simultaneously conducting a disinformation campaign, as I've spoken about, that Schrodinger's Putin or Russia friendly that we have seen of taking over. Of course, the ISW, they have pushed back on this, but given really, they called it baseless, which the claims is baseless. It's just information being pushed out. But the counter to why this makes sense for Russia to do from ISW is incredibly baseless and it doesn't show why this has any incentive for them to do. That it's recent drone incursions to inflame anti-Russian sentiment in Poland, accelerate escalation in the war, and incite European countries to intervene in the war on behalf of Ukraine. That's what they're saying it would be. But the Kremlin is likely setting information conditions to blame Ukraine for future attacks, and Russia itself may conduct against Poland. So the ISW here is saying that no, it's going to be Russia carrying out a false flag and blaming Ukraine, although history has shown that no one's going to believe Russia if they do it. Even if Ukraine does it, they're still not going to believe it was Ukraine, like with Nord Stream, and that there's the pros versus cons in this just aren't there. Again, we're going to push back on this argument in a second. We saw Center for Countering Disinformation. This is an official Ukrainian page here. We know they're serious, as I say, because they're not using capital letters. They falsely accused Ukraine of preparing a high-profile sabotage operation. They have nothing to do in a typical tactic of Russian foreign services, create informational alibi for provocations. Russia itself is responsible for a number of sabotage acts, so creating an alibi. So we're saying, hey, look, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And if it does happen, we're going to say we warned you about this. But seeing all this, it appears to me there's groundwork being laid for something. Let's go back to one of my experts. If the Russian Legion is a formal part of the International Legion, as some suggest, it would explain why it has not been used for anything other than cross-border incursions. If it remained outside of the Ukrainian armed forces, it could be used in name or actuality to conduct other strikes in other areas such as Russian enclaves. It could still do this, but if they are under Ukrainian command, then it cannot be framed as Russian versus Russian. So if these units, which I believe they're not under the International Legion, but if they had provocation in maybe Transnistria, maybe in Kaliningrad, maybe somewhere else, maybe in Belarus, it can be framed as we had nothing to do with that. It's Russian versus Russian. Like when they crossed back into the border, must have been in mid-23 or early 23, maybe late 23, that Ukraine said, we have nothing to do with this. This is Russians versus Russians, although they're in all of our vehicles and our weapons, etc. It doesn't matter. But that's the way it can be framed. For the most part, I believe the Russian Legion is a field army unit with the International Legion, perhaps a missed opportunity to foment partisan activity or conduct deniable operations in vulnerable areas of the Russian Federation, and how that could be used. Again, where did we hear about these legions being used? In these reports, but also ISW claiming that this is what's going to occur. See where this gets so messy, but that's why we need to go back to this. As regular people, we have to examine all claims on the basis of who would ultimately benefit the most. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to argue against my position or hypothesis and why it could be beneficial for Russia to have further grey zone operations and escalate potentially inside of NATO. And then we're going to go over these breaches that we have seen also. Actually, let's go over my part first, and then we'll go over all of this from a gentleman on my Telegram, but then also an expert behind the scenes. Now, it's reported that Russian drones and aircraft are breaching into NATO. Now, what I'll say is probably likely correct, but all these reports, these are coming from intra-European sources, which, as I showed with Nord Stream, can be positioned to be silent if they're needed, or to make information incredibly loud and public if required too. So it's an extension here. The legitimacy of these claims can be questioned, but just for the sake of exercise, let's assume that these breaches, these are legitimate. They're real and they're purposeful. So not only did they happen, that they're purposefully doing it as well. What has it done? Well, it's poked holes in the safety of Europe's air defence. We had airport shutdowns, we had very few drones actually intercepted, and it's also exposed Europe's unwillingness to actually escalate by shooting down Russian fighter aircraft, or the ability to actually intercept many of these drones. This does weaken Europe's rhetoric significantly and can display the limits of support and friendship to Ukraine beyond the rhetoric of however long it takes, whatever it takes, which people that say that, they are lying through their teeth directly to the people of Ukraine. But it has displayed the limits of support. Also, this probing, this is brought into question how committed really is NATO to Article 5? Now, Article 5, this relates to collective defence, meaning an armed attack against one NATO member is an attack against all, requiring them to assist then the attacked party. So if Russia attacked Estonia, therefore Germany and the UK and America are coming in. But that's in theory, that's on paper. Article 5 has never truly been tested by a state, nor has it been tested by a state who has the ability to escalate through its strategic nuclear forces, to the extinction of continents. So not only has it not been tested, it hasn't been tested against that level of threat, albeit this threat commits self-destruction in the process. But again, I know people on Twitter and I know people on Telegram and this and that do not take into account strategic weapon systems like these nuclear weapons, but I guarantee in the halls of Washington, in Germany, in Canberra, in Paris, wherever, this is taken into account. It is. If it wasn't, we would have seen this war waged significantly different from NATO. So we have proof that it is. So it hasn't really been tested. And although the article says that Germany will defend Estonia with all that it's got and America the same, when Munich is on the seesaw of survival, albeit, yeah, it's a I can't say that, but self-destruction mission, usually short destruction, but if it's on the seesaw, I'm not convinced of the Chancellor's decisions. America, under Trump, even less convinced of this, and even the Europeans are not completely convinced of where Trump actually sits, especially with his comments. So is it testing rhetoric, testing response? Could be. Likely is, I think, but it's staying below that threshold. Now, is there a realistic future where Russia does push into the Baltics? Absolutely. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We know that Russia may exit this war with a shitload of experience around not only troops but industry and moving its economy to other areas that won't sanction them, like China, well, for pushing in these areas. So yeah, absolutely, there is. But the narrative, the Schrodinger's Putin, that he's going to do this or able to do this against a threat of Article 5 while struggling in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, It's delusional at best, cunning, deceitful, and manufacturing of escalation actually at worst. So let's go over further pieces on this argument against somewhat of what we have said laid out in the hypothesis of this video. The benefits of this deniable tax is to hurt Ukraine's supporters just enough for them to understand why this is happening, but without the loss of life, or preferably, as that would force the targeted nation into a different response. The potential false flag events we have seen in Europe and have been mostly criminal acts that we all know who is behind it, but it's still officially deniable. Plausible deniability, criminal act, it's someone lighting this on fire or being used or recruited. Evidence of this can be seen in the various factory warehouse fires in Germany, Denmark and France, where defence industry is supporting the Ukrainian war efforts. Some damage to critical infrastructure has been seen, but governments are less keen to attribute this to Russia, as it could be seen as an attack on the population. The general indicator is to look at what's happening in global politics at the time, as there is usually a high level of media shortly after the attack, which is conducted to remind that nation they are vulnerable and shouldn't make certain decisions. So you carry out this using plausible deniability, and then there's a meeting after this to show the vulnerabilities. Until people in Europe start dying, I think the game of deniable strikes in Europe will continue. Russia just has to be careful it doesn't cause mass disruption or casualties. That threshold we've spoken about. The German government did its best to throw smoke over the high voltage pylon sabotage in Berlin last month. But we all know that domestic leftist extremists claim their work usually within 24 hours. And this was a little bit more sophisticated than the usual bullshit in Europe. The most dangerous act I remember leftists doing, also in Germany, was placing a bomb on a train station bins about 15 years ago to protest the Great War on Terror. But they announced the threat and the police found the bombs, that these were mock devices. The situation reads much more like a stab at Mercer's ribs to remind him that Germany is vulnerable. Back to that first paragraph we looked at. Random drone flights over military bases and airports in Germany are somewhat difficult for the German authorities to handle due to the domestic incidents being a police mandate. And police are overwhelmed already due to rowdy guests. The incidents in Norway and Denmark would make sense from a shadow fleet involvement standpoint, as it would have provided the least difficulty pathway for Russian groups to put drones into these airspaces. But at least one drone in Norway was attributed to Singaporean nationals. Maybe Singaporean intel trying to sneak in under the false flag umbrella, or possibly acting as a third-party collector or for another agency or nation. A lot of nuance added to this. Denmark is stubborn. The more you push them, the harder they dig in their heels. Each time they've been provoked in the past 3 years, they have dug in harder on their support for Ukraine. We all know Putin loves a history lesson. So he should know that Denmark have historically and continue to hold keys to the gateway out of the Baltic Sea. Denmark and Sweden could feasibly start detaining and searching vessels within the international legal framework currently in place and practically lock down the Baltic commercial maritime traffic, but not restrict Russian naval fleet. If Russia starts escorting suspected shadow fleet with their navy, they lose deniability and gain culpability over its actions. See this slide mixed with exactly what I spoke about reason to detain these vessels legally and holding here. I just don't see why they would risk the shadow fleet, which is so important to that. But you can see nuance to this added. In terms of creating a false flag incident, I don't see why Russia would feasibly do something within Europe that would deliberately result in mass CAS. Like it or not, Russia knows how to play the game, and it knows that Western civilization under deployed military casualties is not deniable. They could trigger a kinetic response. I think Putin would prefer to remind Europe it remains a threat rather than show how much or little a threat they are. You cannot adjust or recall your hands once you play it. Once the first punch is laid, you don't know where it goes from there. We speak about the Russian Legion being a formal part of this and how it could be used, or maybe it was a missed opportunity for partisan activity in other areas. As far as we know, for Western Europe, there are many Russian diaspora and sympathisers providing information to Russian intelligence. Not all of them are aware of their complicity. Now, this is something you need to look at too in intelligence operations. The people providing information or being recruited, not everyone's actually aware that that is what they are doing at all. The term useful idiot gets thrown around a hell of a lot. I spoke about how with the murder of Mr. Kirk the other day, how it would be, in my opinion, fairly easy for an intelligence service to get someone who's willing to do this, radicalise them, and them not actually be aware that they're complicit in some intel op. Moldova was an interesting case, and I suspect both sides played games with how the election was conducted, absolutely. But I think the outcome wasn't really skewed in either direction by this meddling. Russia's funded groups like the AfD and has stronger relationships with Orban and Fico, both of whom the EU are trying to rid themselves of politically as they challenge the liberal socialist order. There are many groups who are acting as proxies. The majority of drones and attacks on infrastructure in Europe have likely coordinated remotely by Russian intelligence using Russian sympathisers or greedy, vulnerable third country nationals with access and who can sufficiently are motivated to do it. The well-publicised case of Belgian nationals living in the UK who are planning to collect information on Ukrainian soldiers training in Germany is an example of these third-party nationals motivated financially, provide a level of deniability, again, so plausible deniability, again. This is why I think Ukraine missed an opportunity of bringing the Russian Legion into its international legion. There's missed an opportunity by bringing the Russian Legion in. So by bringing them in officially under the armed forces, you may have missed a huge opportunity here. On the Norway and Denmark drones. Now the French boarded a vessel and seized a suspected Shadow Fleet vessel. One thing that surprises me about this whole Shadow Fleet grey war is how little Ukraine has done to Kaliningrad Oblast, as this enclave represents a gap in the armour that is hard to defend now and would cause significant political, strategic, social, reputational damage. GUR has hit Nord Stream and did conduct a couple of drone strikes on infrastructure and shipping within Kaliningrad Oblast. Russia would scream NATO complicity, but Ukraine has proven it doesn't wait for NATO to approve their action in the Baltic region. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. And we have seen that again and again from Nord Stream to other strikes, but also this gap as well, the Suwalki gap that sits right down in Kaliningrad Oblast, in Belarus, and the vulnerability of some of these areas also. This gentleman on my Telegram, he says, well, this is to test and probe NATO's resolve and reaction. If the PSYOP operation succeeds with people largely convinced that it was Ukrainian PSYOP instead of a Russian one, then it would split Polish society even more into pro and anti-Russian camp, and it would favour Russia the more the Poles would be sympathetic towards the Russian cause. So by carrying out this psychological operation, they sell it that it was Ukraine who did it, therefore more people become sympathetic to Russia. Now what I will say is the Poles don't like Ukrainians, but the Poles fucking hate the Russians. Okay, there's a lot of tension there too. But we will see this come to a head, trust me. 3, looking at the reason we're not seeing it come to a head is because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Look at the timing and current events with Trump having a more pro-Ukrainian stance than ever. Of course, it puts pressure on Putin to at least try to do something. So that is how a lot of people are framing these operations. I just don't see, I see the PSYOP as 5-dimensional chess, and as my other gentleman says here, once you've played your hand, you can't take it back. So let's talk about conquering states, return of land, as we get 50 minutes in. Conquering states through force is dangerous, it's expensive, and an endeavour that is prone to failures and Pyrrhic victories. From Afghanistan to Gaza to European states. This is expensive, prone to failures, Pyrrhic victories. The best modern way to influence neighbours and spheres of influence is not through force, it's through seduction. Now, why is this so costly and hard? Well, nationalism is the most potent force, ideology in politics. It trumps democracy, it trumps communism, it trumps liberalism, it trumps autocracy. This is the reason why the pursuit of flipping a state is often a failed mission. Whether it's Islamic, communist, liberal democracy, it doesn't matter. Nationalism trumps it. It's why it's so hard. The best way to do this is not through force, it's through attraction and seduction. Now, the biggest wins for the democratic liberal states against capitalist states against communism was not intervention and toppling of leaders or wars where the Soviets, the communists were looking to expand. It wasn't that. The greatest successes was through the attraction and seduction to the way of life and what's offered through the capitalist system to the neighbours. That was the biggest successes, not through military actions, but from sort of going on your own straight and narrow and seducing people to want that. The Eastern European states, these were not conquered, as you would, if you will, by liberalism. They were seduced by it, and they moved towards Brussels, not Moscow, at the end of the Soviet Union, by their own accord. Of course, there's intelligence operations and all this behind the scenes, but again, I think that is massively overstated of the influence of this. Attraction, seduction, not conquering. And I will say the best way to stabilise Palestine is not through Israeli military actions. We've seen that. It hasn't worked. In my opinion, is having Egypt, a stable, prosperous state that shows regular Palestinians what could be if they had a less extreme government. Now, due to religious reasons, caveats, Israel can't be that seduction. It'd have to be Egypt. But to relate it back to this, the likely best way that I see for Ukraine to regain control of the Donbass or maybe Crimea, if we're confident in the future of Kiev, if we're confident in the future of the unoccupied parts of Ukraine surviving and being prosperous, so if we're confident in that, but we're also unconfident in Ukraine's ability militarily to take these back. So we're assuming that it's going to be prosperous in the remaining parts after, but that Ukraine can't take it back militarily, but Zelensky himself said. The best way to increase your chances of doing this would be to have some level of deal, be Russia have de facto, not de jure, but de facto control of X amount of ground for X amount of years, have Ukraine do as well as they can and seduce these regions through their own autonomy and autonomous regions to come and join the unoccupied areas after a long time. Now, I know this is out there a long time, and it is, but if you're confident in the ability of the survival of the state and unconfident that this can actually be done militarily without being Pyrrhic at best or just a failure, this is where the best way likely sits. And I think history shows that with the best successes of turning states from communism was capitalism doing well. Of course, this isn't foolproof at all. It may not work. But my warning to Europe would be this. We're assuming gravitational pull one way, but be very careful of the gravitational pull, the increasing gravitational pull of Moscow, and that this can happen in reverse. Don't assume it's going to go just one way. European leaders constantly undermine the foundations of democratic liberal societies. And what this does is it increases that gravitational pull of more conservative states like, say, Hungary towards Moscow. And we see Moscow setting themselves up for this through Putin's, what were they called? But like those press releases for traditionalism and saving from liberalism and all of this. We see that groundwork being set. And many, many nations are getting pulled more into the orbit, the gravitational pull of Beijing or Moscow. More and more are, due to where we see the foundations then being undermined by many and the hypocrisy coming to light. And the worst thing that ends up in this, if they're not careful, is that Moscow, through this idea, exactly what we said, through seduction rather than conquering, that they end up with a branch of power into the centre of Eastern Europe, into Hungary or Slovakia without firing a shot. This is why I had someone on the podcast ages back that said invading Ukraine was silly because the way things were going, that in another 5 or 10 years, you probably would have got another very pro-Russian government in and go that way. Of course, this is all theoretical. It's not what we have seen. But there's no other option that's really laying out there at the moment that I see is actually realistic. Legends, we're about to tick over 1 hour, or at least my end. It'll cut a little bit short. Apologies this went for so long. I had no idea how long it was going to go once I was typing this all out, but I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you're looking after yourselves, and please, this is an open academic environment for critique, for opinion, for whatever. I appreciate your time. Have a great weekend, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.